Thank you. It's a pleasure, excuse me, it's a pleasure to be here tonight and to see so many people turn out. I have to confess, I'm a doctor, but I'm not a medical doctor. So any emergencies tonight, I cannot take care of those. And anything I talk about tonight doesn't mean that, I've actually amputated an arm or a leg or that I'm prepared to do that. But as a historian, one of the things that sometimes people forget is that history is about people. That, it's events, it's dates, it's all these boring things. But history is about people. And what I found, there are certain topics that people can relate to. You can talk about music, and it doesn't matter, what period, people recognize music. Food, people eat throughout the ages, and so you can talk about different food at different periods, and that'll interest people. But medicine is one of those things that everybody encounters at one point, either themselves or somebody they know gets sick or gets injured. And we talk about war, and we talk about weapons, and we sometimes are disconnected from that, and we look at casualty figures that in a particular battle, this many people were killed, these people were injured or wounded, but what does that really mean? And so some of these things I'm talking about tonight aren't necessarily going to be earth-shattering or new to you. What I find is that people are pretty intelligent and have a lot of knowledge, but sometimes they just kind of need help putting things together. Like, oh, I never really thought about that. So one of the things I would want you to do is to think about these things we're talking about, and to go up. I've never really thought about being wounded. What does that entail, and what happens when you're wounded? So that's the things that I'm going to talk about tonight. And we're going to start with talking about, as it says, weapons. And I'm not, like I said, this is not earth-shattering. I'm not going to introduce you to the history of weapons, because everybody knows, I would think everybody here knows what a flintlock is. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. But those are the types of things we're going to talk about. Now, this time of history, this is called the Age of Heroic Medicine. And it hasn't really changed at this point in history much from the Greeks or the Middle Ages or the Napoleonic era, that it was thought that your body had these different fluids. And so the key to being healthy was to keep those fluids within balance. And so the idea is you had too much of this fluid, it needed to come out. Things needed to be regulated. And one of the key ideas at that time was about bleeding. You had too much bad blood, so we need to open a vein and let some blood out. So that was very common. Oddly enough, modern medicine has found that sometimes, like if you have high blood pressure, that if you give blood, it reduces high blood pressure. So sometimes there's logic to these things, but the idea of, oh, you look kind of pale, I think we need to bleed you. Here, take this, it'll make you throw up. Here, take this, it'll make you do something else. That was kind of how they would keep things in balance. Now, one of the things is that to cause actions, they would often give you small doses of things that were known to be poison. So they'd give you lead, they'd give you arsenic. And so they knew those things were poison, but we're just going to give you a little. But it's going to create a reaction in the medical field. But the idea was, you're sick, of course you're going to feel bad. You know, you're hurt, of course it's going to hurt. It's going to be pain. These things are just part of the process. Now, in the 1820s and 1830s, there's going to be a change. There's a doctor, put that in quotes, there's a Dr. Thompson, who his followers become known as Thompsonians, and he writes a book, and it's kind of like on everybody their own doctor. You don't need a doctor that has a degree, you know, it's common sense. And so what he says is, we don't need to depend on poisons to regulate our systems, but we can do that naturally. Does that sound kind of like New Age? Kind of like, and so, you know, herbs and things like that. But, you know, you need to drink tea, you need to have hot baths, you need to have cold baths. So his idea was everybody can be a doctor. So that's the background for what we're getting ready to talk about. Now, we did say we would talk about weapons a bit. So just to kind of refresh your memories. So musket, you know, the flintlock musket, muzzle loading. Think of, how many of you you've been barbecuing lately, and you got charcoal briquettes. They're not the cleanest thing, are they? So when you're firing muskets, you know, think of dirt, think of soot, think of smoke. So fairly large caliber, 69 to 72 caliber, weighs about an ounce. Now there's some debate on this. Most muskets, because they're smoothbore, there's this idea that you can't hit anything out past 25 yards. Well, you can, especially at that particular type of tactics. It wasn't designed that you were going to hit the bullseye, but you were going to hit the bull. And so, you know, you may not be hitting that person in the head, but you're going to be hitting either him or something by him. So the effective range is, you don't want to get hit at 300 yards with a musket ball. Velocity is going to be important. And there is a musket ball that's been cut in half and shows you what it is. And then on the right is the buck and ball, which you have one ball and then three smaller balls on top of that. Now, the really important thing is this piece of ballistic gel. And I could say, go to the internet, go to YouTube, and look up ballistic test. And see, I don't have that on here because I didn't want to actually gross people out. Because I said I'm not a medical doctor, I didn't want to have to go out and treat people. But, so this is a block of ballistic gel that's had a Brown Bess musket shot into it. And so you can see how far it traveled, and you can see the wound channel. Now what you can't see is, and this is what you have to keep in mind as we talk about tonight, is there's the wound channel, but what happens is this is where physics comes into play. That once the musket ball hits that ballistic gel or hits a body, it's going to impart energy. And so what you see is a neat little wound channel, but if you go to YouTube, what you'll see is that wound channel expands. And it does it very quickly, but that wound that goes from being that big, at one point it's that big. And so it's pushing all the tissue away from it. And so that's what's happening. So it isn't, you know, just that, oh, it's poking a hole. No, it's actually causing a rupture of tissue. So this is This is a musket. I found these on the internet, these pictures. They're pretty interesting, I thought. But here you have a pistol. And so, of course, the velocity and the range will be less, but it'll still do some damage. So, pistols. Now, one thing that you think of pistols is this is the age of dueling. So, maybe not warfare, but think of Andrew Jackson dueling Mr. Dickinson, who he shoots and kills, and other notable duels. So dueling with pistols, this is certainly fits into this time period. Rifles, flintlock rifles, range is greater, ball is smaller, velocity is greater, and that velocity is going to be important because the greater the velocity, it's going to be traveling faster and it'll be moving faster through tissue. So for sake of comparison, AR-15, about 3 times faster than a flintlock rifle. 9mm, about the same velocity as a musket. So these are the firearms, or the shoulder or the handheld weapons. And then we have artillery. And I imagine that most of you are familiar with artillery of the time period, like a large musket loaded at the muzzle. Think of the musket cartridges, only bigger, so a single ball, or something like this. It has multiple projectiles. And so, a whole range. Again, think of when this is being fired at you, it's not just the projectile, but it's all the burnt and unburnt powder and the smoke and the other bits of dirt that are being flung at you. So with artillery, if you get hit on by an artillery projectile, your wound is going to be catastrophic and probably fatal. So there's a kind of a scale between getting hit with a musket ball and getting hit with something like this. So those are the firearms. And then we have, of course, weapons that are designed to cut or to thrust. So the bayonet, of course, bowie knives, sabers, and this is still an age of where, if you're here on the frontier, of arrows. So what happens when you get hit with an arrow? That I was reading recently that hunting arrows and war arrows are different. That hunting arrows are designed where the projectile or the arrow point is more secure, because they would want to be able to retrieve the arrows. Where war arrows, it's tied on loosely so that if you pull the shaft, it will leave the point in. So some Native American technology, in case we get back to that point. You might want to keep that in mind. Now, what I didn't put up here is, what if somebody takes that musket and hits you in the head with it? So that's another type of weapon. A fist. What happens if you get hit with a fist? That produces a wound. So types of wounds. So let's think about this. Lacerations or cuts. Okay, you can kind of think of what you might have gotten that from. Punctures, Bullets puncture, bayonets puncture, contusions. So you get a hard knock. Burns. So, and fractures. Now, this is the category of, how do you judge how bad a wound is? A slight, it's a flesh wound. Severe penetration by stabbing, gunshot, or other. And dangerous is to the head, to the chest, or to the internal organs. So those are how, when you read in reports, when they're talking about this wound being dangerous, that's what it's talking about. So who knows what this image is over here? You have a man who's been wounded. Well, that's Samuel Ringgold. This is from 1846, and this is depicting an actual event in the war with Mexico that happened at the Battle of Palo Alto down by Brownsville. He's on his horse, or he was on his horse, and a cannonball, small cannonball or a piece of grape, goes through both of his thighs while he's on his horse, goes through his horse, so it's going through one leg, through his horse, and out the other. And so he's killed. It's a mortal wound, but that's an example of what artillery can do, and did do in his case. So who's going to treat you? Well, it can be anybody. It can be, if you're wounded or if you're injured, it may be your neighbor that comes to help you. But it's anybody that's got some medical knowledge. So if it's, in a civilian context, it may be, go get Granny so-and-so. She knows how to do this. So it's the training. How do you become a doctor at that point? It's much looser than it is today. One way was they had these new fangled things called medical schools. So if you lived in a city, you might go to a medical school, a medical college, and get actual training. But one of the more common ways to do it was an apprenticeship, where you would go to your local area doctor and you would make an arrangement. I'll come do chores for you, but you let me read your medical books and let me, you teach me about medicine. And then when you think I'm ready to go on my own, I'll go out and I'll hang my shingle and I'll be Dr. So-and-so. So, kind of an informal way to do that. Or, if you're a Thompsonian, every man is doctor. Hey, I'm a doctor. I've got Dr. Thompson's book here. I can cure you. Now, talking about medical schools, there are, by 1835, there are at least 30 medical schools in the United States. So they're fairly common. They're usually in larger cities like New York or Philadelphia. Very famous one in Kentucky called Transylvania, not to be confused with the other Transylvania. But so there are medical schools, and it's almost in the 1820s and 1830s, kind of like the advice that we give today is, learn to code. Have you heard that? Learn to code, learn how to be a computer engineer. Well, this time, young man, be a doctor. It was a way to become successful. So what you're going to find when you start reading history is it's astonishing how many people you're reading and you're going, oh, they had medical training. You know, they started off to be a doctor, but then they became something else because it was the gateway to success. Now, civilian versus military doctors, there's going to be a difference. And the first statement there is to remind you of, you know, when we think of wounds, we think of battles, think of war. But the 19th century, and you could say this about the 18th century, the 17th century going on back, you could say this about today. They're dangerous places. You know, you can get hurt doing most anything. I grew up on a farm. And so in a farming community, you know, we'd often hear, you know, so-and-so got his foot torn off in a such and such machine. I was at Wilson's Creek a few years ago working on a museum exhibit, and the staff came in and said, you know, that volunteer who brought his horse and doing cavalry stuff, well, he had the reins wrapped around his hands, and his horse jerked its head and pulled his fingers off. So if you're around animals, animals hurt you. You know, animals kick you. How do you get firewood at this time? You know, you chop wood. So you chop your foot. So it's a dangerous thing. And so doctors dealt with injuries and dealt with wounds. Now, part of the difference is if you're a civilian doctor, you're going to see much less or fewer of those types of injuries than if you are a military doctor, because you're going to have incidents happening less often. So part of it would be the sheer volume of wounds and wounded people that you're asked to deal with at any one particular time. That's also going to affect how much experience you have. So if you treat a lot of gunshot wounds, you're going to be more experienced at it than if you just do it occasionally. And so when we think of the Texas Army, and because we are talking about the Texas Revolution, it's an army that's composed of civilians. And it becomes, you know, a formalized military institution. But all the doctors that are going to be associated with the Army, Texas Army, come from civilian life. So, you're wounded. Let's talk about being wounded. So, you're wounded on the field. What happens? If you start to read diaries, a lot of times they'll say, I didn't realize I was wounded. You know, and I continued to fight. And then I felt lightheaded. But, so once you realize you're wounded, you know, who helps you? You know, it's the people around you. And one account that I'll go back to again is Alonzo Steele, who's wounded here at San Jacinto. And what he says is, you know, I was wounded. I didn't realize it. Then when I realized it, my friend said, hey, I'll stay with you. And he said, no, you go ahead and keep fighting. So he stays behind. So you're wounded, and you stay there until really the battle is over. And so who's going to help you? It's going to be those people that are around you, come back to check on you. And then in Steele's case, another soldier finally comes over and helps him. Severity of the wound. You know, so there's a difference in how severe you're wounded. Are you just, you know, it's a flesh wound. or, you know, it's pretty serious. The location of the wound, you know, where do you get hit? How many of you saw my favorite movie, Ride with the Devil? Nobody? Well, one of the stars gets his little finger shot off. And you don't think about that, but it's like, well, yeah, I guess you could get your little finger shot off. Or your horse could tear your fingers off with the reins wrapped around. Angle the wound. So, are you, you know, think about geometry. And in most movies, you know, people get shot straight on. But what if you get shot from above? Or what if you get shot from below? I was just reading artillery shells that are exploding in front of people, and so a lot of the wounds are directed up towards the person. You know, so that affects, you know, the angle at which you're shot. You know, your body's made up of different systems. You got the circulatory system, you've got all these systems. You learned this in 8th grade. Kind of reach back there and pull it out. But you've got a digestive system. So what all is injured? You know, are the nerves injured? Are blood vessels injured? Is the skeleton injured? You know, are organs injured? How much injury is going to be, you know, determine, you know, what happens to you? You know, how long are you on the field? You know, you're probably not going to get treatment for several hours, if not for maybe days. And so what the doctors would tell you, what the medical doctors tell you back then is it's easier to examine fresh wounds than it is to examine wounds that have had time to become inflamed. And this is a big one. Foreign matter that gets carried into the wound. So remember we talked about the charcoal? So, you know, that bullet that's going into you isn't pristine. You know, it's been fired out of a musket. And so it's covered with sulfur and charcoal, carbon. Yeah, so it's going to be carried into the wound. The other big thing is that when you're hit with a musket ball or a pistol ball, is think about it pokes a hole in whatever clothing you're wearing. And so it'll carry a little punctured piece of cloth. How many shirts you have on, how many coats you have on. Does it hit a button? So it'll carry that into the wound. And so that is part of it. Also, you know, it talks about it'll punch out a little plug of skin and carry that into the wound. So it isn't just the projectile that's going in there. Or if it is artillery projectile that's exploding or hitting something, often it'll push rocks. Or if it hits wood, you'll have, especially in wooden ships, you'll have splinters that become projectiles. So it isn't just, you know, that neat little punctured bullet that goes in there. It's what gets carried into the wound with it. Infection, everybody understands infection. Your attitude is going to, you know, do you have oh, you've lost your arm. Well, be cheerful. you know, do you, you know, how do you approach being wounded? Are you positive or are you not positive? You know, it's kind of hard to think about, well, be positive. You just had your leg shot off. But that is going to help determine mentally how you do. And then, of course, the weather, the climate, that, is it hot, humid? Think about laying in about being here in Houston, and sweating there in the summer, that would hinder healing. So these are the types of things that are all conditions of how well you're going to do. All right. So this is kind of, where are you hit and what's going to happen? Well, getting hit in the head is going to be bad. I think most people would agree with that. Because that's where your brain is. And that's pretty important. So there are discussions, and where I get this from is doctors, medical doctors, military doctors would write up reports. I was in this war, and this is what we did for this, and this is what we saw. So they're talking about case histories. So they discuss, anything from a minor scalp wound. See, I had a cat scratch me the other day. Had a minor scalp wound. But the idea is, did it break the skin? Did it depress the bone? Did it enter the cranium? So it's pretty grim as to, if it breaks the cranium and enters the cranium. But think about this today. If you had a head injury, what was one of the first things they'd do when you get to the hospital? They'd probably put you in some sort of machine, wouldn't they? So they could see where the damage was. They don't have that machine. So they have to look at you and kind of suppose what the injury is going to be. So getting hit in the head is going to be pretty bad. And if you are hit with a projectile, they're probably not going to go in and try to retrieve it. Now, what's odd is in reading some of these cases, you'd expect people to die, but they were shot in the head, and then several weeks later they were coughing and the bullet came out. So kind of miraculous things happen. If you're shot in the face, I don't think many of us would want to get shot in the face, but you have a lot of blood vessels. And so the consensus is, if you don't have a lot of nerve damage, that usually the blood flow will help promote healing, and you may be disfigured, but you're going to heal, and you're going to heal very quickly. So that's kind of the good news. But, you may be disfigured. There is, from the war with Mexico, another Mexican war story, at the Battle of Palo Alto, where Major Ringo gets his horse killed and himself killed. There's a captain of infantry named John Page, and he gets his lower jaw shot off by a Mexican cannonball. So imagine having your lower jaw shot off. It's not fatal. It's going to be mortal, but it's not immediately fatal. And so there are accounts of him. He gets sent back to the United States, but it takes him about a month to die. So think about how horrible, again, in movies, on television, you get shot. Oh, that's not the case. So disfiguring. Another story from the war with Mexico. There's a surgeon who treats a Texas Ranger who's been shot right under the nose. And he removes the bullet from his palate, and he sees him several weeks later, and the man's grown a mustache. And he says, he seemed to, you couldn't tell. So, facial wounds, horrible. Upper chest. There's a lot of discussion on this. Is the lung punctured? Is it contused? How badly is it injured? If both lungs are involved, usually it's going to be fatal. So, shot in the chest. Think about, do a middle image of the Invisible Man or the Visible Man. How many of you had a Visible Man when you were growing up? The little plastic figure with the clear plastic on the outside, and you can see all the veins and all. Well, think about where your organs are, and think, okay, maybe it's going to hit something. Maybe it's going to, but kind of a roadmap of where projectiles can go. Lower chest depends on the injury, and think what you've got in your lower chest. Your diaphragm, and that's where you start to have your liver and your spleen and your stomach. If you get into the area that we call the gut, your intestines, that's often going to be fatal because it usually sets up for infection. And again, they're not going to put you on an operating table, and be able to open you up and do all the repairs and then sew you back together. It'll usually be fatal and often very painful. Arms, survivable. Legs, survivable. Joints, survivable. So, this is where you can get injured. Now, we usually think of amputation as sort of the thing that comes to mind when we think of wounds at this time. You've got a paper cut. We're going to have to take that arm off. It wasn't quite like that. It, from a civilian standpoint, remember talking about chopping wood? You've whacked yourself in the leg with an axe. That might lead to an amputation at some point. You had a chain wrapped around your ankle or your hand, and your mule pulled it and mangled your hand. We may have to amputate that. But amputation wasn't just, the standard thing to go to. The criteria was, is the limb so badly damaged that it can't be put back together? So is it unsalvageable? Or the other idea was, we can save it, but it's going to be an impediment to movement. So it's just going to hang there, or your leg is going to be stiff and you won't be able to move. So the idea was, what can we do to make your life better? And it may not sound like, well, cutting your arm off is making your life better, or cutting your leg off, but it's, what can we do that's going to be least impactful so that you can have a more normal life? Now, you can remove a limb pretty fast. And one surgeon said, a good surgeon can do it in 80 seconds. So, get your clock going and time yourself 80 seconds and go, okay. But the idea was, yeah, you can do it fast. And doing it fast was, one reason to do it fast was not because we're having a contest to see who can do it the fastest, but this is going to hurt. So the faster we can do it, the least pain we're putting that person through. So speed's important. But the other caution was you need to be careful in how you do it. Because think about it, it isn't just, like taking a circular saw and going, cutting it straight off, but there are blood vessels, there's muscles. The blood vessels and the muscles tend to retract because they're kind of like big rubber bands. And so you have to be able to pull those back out. You have to leave enough skin to have a flap. And you need to be able to properly pad the stump and close it off so that you don't have to come in and do secondary amputations. Now, from the Alamo, talking about medicine to visitors, we had some unique experiences. I was with one man, we were doing medical, and we were talking about amputations, and this very well-dressed lady in her probably early 30s came in and was standing there and said, we're talking about what you do to the stump, and she takes her hand and says, you mean like this? And she had a prosthetic hand that looked just like a regular hand. She had a ring on, had her nails painted, but she pulled it off and she'd had her hand amputated. And then she pulled up her dress and showed us where her leg had been amputated. So we were kind of shocked and said, yeah, kind of like that. I was talking to an actual doctor, talking to a surgeon once, and he was telling me that he had treated a case where a man had had his lower leg amputated, or his foot amputated at the lower leg, but he was in constant pain. And he said, so after several years, I went in there and I had to do a secondary operation. And what I found was that one of his nerve bundles had been put up against a blood vessel. And that every time his heart would pump, he'd get a blast of blood coming through that blood vessel, and it would hit the nerve. And he said, so what I had to do was I had to go in there and separate those, and it stopped his pain. So again, the idea of do it, but do it well. And I had a Navy corpsman, this was during the Iraq War, who talked to me about a lot of the cases that they would treat were secondary wounds from explosions, where I talked about rocks and glass and bits of metal, not necessarily a projectile per se hitting somebody, but all these secondary projectiles that were caused by an explosion. So if you have an amputation, you want it done well. You want it done quickly, but you want it done well. So, like I said, today if you're injured, if you're wounded, they take you to the hospital and they put you in a machine to see where you're wounded, how serious it is, and identify the wound tract. So repeatedly in medical literature at that time, doctors or surgeons will say, we've got probes, but the best probe is your finger. So think of your finger, and they say, well, this is the benefits, because your finger can actually feel. It's sensitive. So it can feel bone. It can feel foreign material. The problem is your finger only reaches so far. And so they talked about, well, we'd like to use your index finger, but sometimes you have to use your little finger. So, the size of the wound. So think of that ballistic gel that I showed you where you got the wound going through it, but the idea of it going and then closing back up. So you have that going through your body wherever the wound is. So the doctor's trying to identify, the path of the projectile. So things that they're looking for, did the bullet go in? Is it a penetrating wound? Very important. Is there an exit wound? So if an entrance and an exit, very important because, projectile probably is not in there. If there's no exit wound, it's probably still there, which will be a matter that we talk about. How much injury is there? And as we talked about, the foreign material, is there part of the shirt there? Can you remove it? There's a little plug of skin, bone fragments. If the bone's shattered and there's pieces of sharp bone, can you pull those out? Removing everything that's not supposed to be there. The other part, from military literature, there are cases, one surgeon's talking about, I was treating a facial wound and there was a bone protruding from upper jaw of a soldier who was injured. And I was puzzled because I couldn't see how the bone would actually be out of position. And then he said, I realized it was the jawbone of the soldier who had been standing by him. So, your friends, your comrades, when they're hit, they're turned into projectiles. Same surgeons giving another story about how they amputated on a man, or not amputated, but they operated on a man who had been hit in the area of the hip. And they said, here, we took these coins out of your wound. And he said, I didn't have any coins in my pocket. And so again, the idea is that a soldier standing by him with coins in his pocket had been hit, and those coins had been driven into another soldier standing by him. So on the other part, it didn't necessarily just, that clean projectile, that bullet that's hitting you. They're going to determine the best course of treatment when they're doing on this examination, and sometimes it will take hours or a few days to really determine what is happening. If you're injured in the chest, are you coughing up blood? You may not be doing that in the beginning, but does that develop? How does your breathing develop? If you're hit in the stomach or the gut region, is there going to be blood in your stool? If you're hitting the kidney, is there going to be blood in your urine? So it may not take a while, or it may take a while for that to show up, but that'll be an indication of what has been injured. And discharge was considered to be healthy and normal. So today we'd think of, your wound is discharging, that was thought to be normal. And it was thought to be helpful because it would work any impurities out of the wound. So it was thought to be part of the normal process. And they didn't necessarily want the wound to heal from the outside. They wanted to heal from the inside, because if it closed over, then it could still be infected on the inside. So the idea is, let's keep the wound open so it can heal from the inside out. Doctors at the Alamo. There are actual doctors at the Alamo. Not all of them are actually practicing doctors. For example, John H. Forsyth was the captain of Travis's company. So he's acting in the military capacity, not as a doctor. But there are two doctors who are trained at medical school there. John Purdy Reynolds, Jefferson Medical College from Philadelphia, and Amos Pollard from Vermont Medical Academy in Vermont. So actual doctors. Now, one of the interesting things about at the Alamo is you had the Battle of Behar in December of 1835, and you had a number of wounded that were still convalescing and were there at the Alamo during the siege of the Alamo. And what we know is that the hospital at the Alamo was on the second story of the long barrack. And when we think of the battle, we think of, the soldiers fighting. But at one point during the battle, Mexican soldiers go into the hospital and they kill everybody there. So doctors and patients. So doctors at the Alamo. There's doctors here at San Jacinto. And like I said, it's astonishing when you start looking and going, I didn't know he was a doctor. But here you've got some very famous ones. You've got Nicholas Labate. You've got Lorenzo de Zavala, who's not on the battlefield, but whose house is nearby. He's a doctor, and many of the wounded here at San Jacinto are taken to him for care. And of course, very famous picture of, painting, not a picture, but of Sam Houston being treated by his ankle wound. Now, Houston's ankle wound is pretty interesting and indicative of the types of wounds and the complications from wounds, because he gets shot in the ankle. And so you go, oh, he gets shot in the ankle. But it shatters bones. And so they are picking bone fragments out of his wounds for days and weeks after. And so that's going to impede how that's going to heal. And he's going to be taken to New Orleans because it's like, well, that's where the specialists are. So we're going to take you to where you can get some actual care. Oddly enough, we talked about Alonzo Steele, shot in the lung. He gets taken to de Zavala's house and treated there. So de Zavala, who's not at the battle, ends up being called into services because he's a doctor, and his house is used as a hospital. So, like I said, all the doctors in the Texas Army are going to come from civilian life. And often this is, first time they're going to see this amount of wounds, and these types of wounds are here. Now, these are the casualties, and I won't say this is the definitive list of casualties in the Texas Revolution, but you've got Goliad, the taking of Goliad. That's going to be Samuel McCullough, who's wounded in the shoulder and is taken off, and what the Handbook of Texas says is that several months later he's treated by de Zavala, who removes the ball from his shoulder, finally removes the ball from his shoulder. So I said we'd talk about this one thing because it's very important, and that's, what do you do if the projectile or the ball is still in you? And the idea was, we want to remove it. We don't want to leave the projectile in you because it can set up for infection. Also, it won't stay where it is. They tend to travel. So the idea is, we know it's going to travel, and it may travel where it does some more harm than if it stays right where it is. And we know that Andrew Jackson had lived with bullets in him. Sam Houston likely had bullets in him. So the idea is, if we can't get to it, we have to leave it. And so the idea is, what do you have to do to get to it? And if you have to dilate or you have to cut so much, so deep, it's like, well, that's causing a worse wound. So it's better to just leave it and not have to, go digging around for it than it is to open up a bigger incision. So that's why you would get a musket ball left in you. It was too deep, or they just didn't know where it went. Again, because they didn't have that MRI machine to be able to put you in and find it. So, yeah, it's in there somewhere. Battle of Concepcion. Now, Battle in Tampico, that's one of my favorite incidents in the Texas Revolution. And a lot of people going, I've never heard of it. Because Tampico's in Mexico. But it's that idea that the Texas Revolution is a bigger event within a Mexican ongoing civil war. But you have wounded there, and you have executions. Battle of Behar, we know one of the wounded is a loss of an eye, and another one is loss of a leg through amputation. And the medical report for Behar actually categorizes them as to 2 mortal, 7 dangerous, 11 severe, and 3 slight. Doesn't tell you what those are, but it kind of categorizes them. Battle of the Alamo, San Patricio, Agua Dulce, Coletta Creek, Goliad Massacre. Then we get to San Jacinto. And this is from the preliminary battle report. The wounded and the killed have been updated later, but 3 killed, severely wounded, 5 slightly wounded, 11. Houston is in that severely wounded category. So we've been talking about the Texans. So let's talk about the Mexican army. That the Mexican army at the time of the Texas Revolution did not have an organized medical department. It'll be organized several years later. And so when it marches into Texas, if you are a high-ranking officer, you may have a doctor with you, but there is no doctors overall for the army. So who takes care of you? If you get sick, it's going to be your comrades. It's going to be, there are thousands of camp followers that are following the Mexican army, made up of wives and girlfriends and families. And so you get sick, you get injured, it's probably going to be your family that takes care of you, that's accompanying the army. Or it will be local citizens that are called into action. So if you are a Mexican soldier, there's not going to be a doctor who's going to come and check on you. And so going back to Battle of the Alamo, right, and then the Goliad Massacre, one of the things that happens at the Goliad Massacre is that the Mexican army is kind of deliberate and sets the doctors and people with medical experience aside and don't execute them because they still need them to help treat Mexican wounded. And one of the doctors says that Goliad, they wouldn't let us treat the Texas prisoners until we treated the Mexican wounded. So after the battle, or after the execution, 2 of the doctors Jack Shackelford and Joseph E. Bernard are sent from sorry, chokes me up. Are sent from Goliad to San Antonio to treat Mexican officers. Who've been wounded at the Battle of the Alamo. And so, have to change eyewear. This is Dr. Bernard's journal. And so he's writing April 21st. Does that date ring a bell? So he's in San Antonio writing April 21st. Says, yesterday and today, we have been around with the surgeons, Mexican surgeons, of the place to visit the wounded, and a pretty piece of work Travis and his faithful few have made of them. There are now about 100 here of the Mexican wounded there in San Antonio. The surgeon tells us that there were 400 of them brought into the hospital the morning they stormed the Alamo. But Bernard says, I think there were more than that. But that's, I guess, his Texan bias. But he goes on and says, we have 2 colonels, a major, and 8 captains under our charge who were wounded in the assault. We have taken 1 ward to the hospital under our charge. Their surgical department is shockingly conducted, and not an amputation performed before we arrived. So this is, again, late April. Battle's on March 6th. Although there are several cases even now that should have been operated upon at the first, and many have died from the want of operation. And he says, there has scarcely been a ball cut out yet, almost every patient carrying the lead he received that morning. So that's his comment on the Mexican wounded from the Battle of the Alamo under the treatment of the Mexicans. Now, remember the picture of the arrows and the knives? While he's there, a party of Comanches have come to town and have done some trading. And then a few days later, a Mexican family, is attacked outside of San Antonio. San Antonio is a dangerous place. There's probably parts of San Antonio today that still kind of dangerous. But it was more dangerous back in the 1830s. And so he says it's probably, the Mexicans say it's Taranculas, not Caranculas, but with a T. But he says it's probably those Comanches that were here in town. But they've attacked a Mexican family. And so he and Dr. Shackelford treat the wounded Mexicans from this Indian attack. And he says one Mexican lady's been stabbed in the stomach badly, and several days later he reports that she died of her wound. Another Mexican woman has been scalped, and several days later he says, well, she's doing better. So being scalped is not necessarily fatal. But the idea of, again, being on the frontier, not always gunshots and battles, but think about the arrows and the Indians and such. And so, like I said, I've never done an amputation myself. I lived on a farm. I think I assisted in birthing some calves and doing stuff like that. But I find the medical literature of this period pretty interesting. And it's interesting because these doctors would, there were medical journals So, look up the New Orleans Medical Journal, and you can read case histories, but you get the idea of what life was like. And again, what is more human than being injured and recovering? So I hope that, again, like I said, if you want the real gross stuff, it's on the internet. You all got the internet. Go find it. But I just want you to think about these things, and hopefully I piqued your interest. This was beneficial. I know it was beneficial to me. Hope it was beneficial to you. So thank you very much.